Hello, everybody. Hello, Renee. Thank you very much, Renee. Lovely to be here and to be able to talk with you all. Um, I can structure this any way you like. It's probably best if I do a bit of an introduction in a second as to why and how I got into this, dare I say, slightly remarkable materials a number of years ago. But also, I very much like this to be a two-way discussion. So, as Renee says, if you do have questions make my life a lot easier because it then lets me know exactly the directions you'd like me to move in to talk about. And if there's any particular subject, and even if you don't have a question as such, feel free to just say to Rene, get him to talk about toxicity, get him to talk about color strength, get him to talk about light fastness, anything that comes to mind. So please don't hesitate. That's probably, as I say, appropriate that I start off by explaining how and why all those years ago I got into this. As you can detect, and as you probably know, I'm an Englishman. And back in England in the years of, let me think, 1976, I became an art student and I left after doing 3 years I did a year's foundation, then 3 years doing fine art on the edge of London in a place called Epsom. Epsom School of Art and Design at the time was rather unusual because it was one of the only courses in England that still encouraged and practiced figurative art at the time. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with non-figurative, but that was my and still is my main direction. And fortunately, they also had a particular sympathy and understanding of materials and if you like some old-fashioned disciplines, things like the practice of drawing and so on. So it was a very good environment for me to be in, although I certainly wasn't by any means a prolific student. But anyway, so I was doing the 3 year fine art course, and I was coming to the end of the course, and I decided one day, out of pure frustration of trying to be this successful artist, I decided to take a trip into the downtown area of London to go to our National Gallery, and of course at the time, and I still to this day pay homage to the well-known big names, and I always make a beeline straight to the Dutch school and stand in awe looking at the Rembrandts. And on this particular day, I was standing looking at a self-portrait, and it's rather a characteristic one. It's got a round top, which I believe was cut some years later. But anyway, it's a portrait which is described as self-portrait at the age of 34, and for me, it's the quintessential Rembrandt. And as I stood looking at this, I thought, will I ever be able to paint like this? And I looked at the surface of the paint and I thought, well, there's something distinctly different about his painting. And laugh if you want about, the concept that I might even one day be able to paint like him. But clearly he's a genius, and I'm far from anything like that in terms of ability even today. But even if I just looked at the paint surface, I could see there was something distinctly different about his material. And of course, I looked at the little caption beneath each painting that I was observing, and it would say oil on linen, oil on panel. And I thought to myself, this is strange because my oil paints don't look like this. It's as if I'm painting with a different medium. I may as well be painting with acrylic or watercolor. There was, the luminosity simply, the intensity, the richness of the color simply wasn't there. So, having seen these little panels, I thought, well, this is strange. So I went back to college, and I headed straight for the professor who was sort of like the guru guy in the college. His name was Graham Beeching, very eccentric, fun guy to be with on any day. And I nonchalantly sat down with Graham and I said, Graham, I've just been up in the National looking at the Rembrandts, and there's something very different about his paint. And he went, yes, 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 of course, Michael. And then he just said these words. He said, you have to remember, at one time, all artists used to make their own paint. And I went, oh, right, okay. And he said, if you want to know more, I can tell you a book to get, which will tell you how to make paint. And if you're feeling brave enough, you can give it a go. And of course, a little light went on in my head, which of course, but when you're 19 or 20, there's no mountain on the planet which is not climbable. That's how you sort of think, your ambitions as a young guy or lady as such. And so I immediately thought, well, I'm going to do that, and who knows, I'll be painting like Rembrandt by the end of the month. And he said, of course, the book you should pick up is The Artist's Handbook of Methods and Techniques by Ralph Mayer. And I have one placed. You can just see it there, right there with my fingers pointing in my bookcase behind. And it's a bit of a sort of a Bible, if you like, of art materials. And I invite all artists to read it. Although it's 300 or 400 pages, you can see it's quite a thick volume. The section which is really, really, really relevant, particularly with oil painting, for instance, is only oh, not even 100 pages. And it's one of those, there's a section probably about 20, 30 pages, which talks specifically about what I learnt from it. And it's a sort of, it's, I advise all artists to get the book. It covers everything anyway, from watercolors to acrylics to the natures of pigments. And, I almost implore it should be the number one book that all artists have. And sure enough, I got a volume. I read it and I read the section, and I just thought, oh, this is too easy. This is going to be like falling off a log. So I made a modest investment in the hand grinding materials on Muller and Slab, which is a bit like a pestle and mort. And the colors that I decided to go for, I decided, well, rather than sort of leap in to get the portrait colors right, I'll give myself a bit of an easy start. I'll go for the browns, the dark backgrounds that were particularly in the Rembrandt self-portraits, the shadows and such. So I picked up raw umber and burnt umber. Those were the first two colors I made, and I started grinding away. And as soon as I ground it, I just thought, yeah, now we're talking. Now we're seeing a fruitiness. There's something more vibrant about the color, and it was, I mean, oh, that doesn't matter now. I can now start the painting. And so I started applying it into my own painting. And I remember day two was a bit of a surprise because the paint actually dried. And I was thinking, wow, this really does work. It's not as if you have to be doing some really clever stuff to make it even dry, like a drying activator. These things actually work totally by their own accord. More importantly, it was one of those occasions where I was painting a portrait, and it was a self-portrait, surprise, surprise. And it would be one of those occasions where suddenly the hours go. You start painting at 10 in the morning, the next thing it's 4 o'clock in the afternoon. By which time friends were coming to my studio and going, oh, someone's had a bit of a breakthrough. What is it, a new medium? And I go, no, I'm making my own colors, and making my own oil paints. And the other fellow friends went, no, come on, stop pulling our legs. What is this? Is it a new medium that Winsor & Newton's brought out? No, look. So I got the stuff out and showed them, wow, you're not kidding. You really are making paint. And they said, can we have a bit? So I put them, shoved a bit into the base end of tubes and folded it over them. Off they went to the studios. Of course, a few hours later, they were back and saying things like, Michael, you need to come to our studios. You need to see what you've just done, what you've done to our paintings. And I thought, oh my goodness, don't tell me something's gone wrong. Has it burned a hole through the canvas, or what could have possibly happened? Because they were looking very earnestly at me. I went into their studios, and lo and behold, they were having the same sort of result as me. They were having what we tend to call in artistic circles a breakthrough. And at that moment, I suddenly thought, well, okay, this is quite interesting. Obviously, I'm going to be making more colors for myself now because, I'm having this breakthrough. And I thought, well, okay, I'm going to be leaving college soon, and rather than sort of getting a job waiting tables or bar work, which of course was in those days the traditional route that we young artists were taking before we became world famous artists, rather than doing that, I could set myself up in my studio making a bit of paint and simply selling it to 10 friends, and that way I could derive a living from it and be in my studio all day. And anyway, that plan worked to a degree, bearing in mind that my room at the time was a room that I'd rented from a friend. It was about 15 foot by 15 feet, and I had my bed in there. The wardrobe was totally in the way. So what I did, I tipped it over on its side, and that was the right height to become a workbench. And that's where I had all my paint making apparatus. And then on the other side was, of course, my easel. So I was literally living in a 15-foot area grinding paint away. And any of you who have done any grinding of pigments will know that it gets pretty dusty and dirty. And every day I'd look, particularly if I was wearing a white shirt like this, and I'd see usually a blue collar where the dust particles had settled. And although I was wearing a mask, always wear a mask, it was still settling on everything. So you can imagine the chaos of trying to live in this one room. So eventually I moved it to a neighbour's cellar. That was a bit better, but a rather interesting thing happened. It's amazing how quickly word of mouth, when you do something like this, can spread. And the phone rang, and it was a gentleman introduced himself, and he said, "Hello, Mr. Harding. My name is Tim Miller. I'm calling from the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, and we've heard about these paints that you're making, and we're in the midst of a rather large restoration project, and we need some lead white made, and we were wondering if you'd be able to do this for us." And I thought, my goodness, the Victoria and Albert Museum calling me up to see if I can make some paint for them. And of course, they were huge volume. It was actually scary. And in those days, I could probably make a couple of tubes an hour, and they wanted pints of the stuff. They were restoring an 18th century organ that Mozart had played upon. It had been fire damaged, and they'd used dental tools to peel off all the old lead white primer that had been on there, and now wanted to replace it. So I immediately started making this paint for them. It took me months, but I was successful. And also, again, a second call came from a gentleman who introduced himself, and he said, "Hello, Mr. Harding. My name's James Trimble. I'm calling from the Royal College of Art in London. We hear great things about these paints you're making. Is there any chance that you can make some so that the students can try?" And I honestly thought he was going to give me an order perhaps for a dozen tubes. He gave me an order for 450 tubes. And so suddenly I had an exploding business upon me. And I moved from the neighbour's cellar to a light industrial unit. And then I started, because then I was incurring, if you like, overheads. And I'll be absolutely frank with you, I wasn't charging enough for the paint. So slowly I was slipping into debt, and I decided that I'd have to advertise, sell more paint, and that would solve the problem. And I made some mistakes. I advertised in the wrong magazines and ended up in debt. And I got taken to court for an advertising debt. And that was the 15th of October, 1987. The years had trickled past. And that was a rather significant night in the UK because we had a hurricane. And although I survived the day in court and all the rest of it and was paying the money off, the next day I woke up and I was thinking, oh, I've got to get away from this terrible paint making thing. Why on earth did I do that? So, surprise, surprise, I then spent the next 4 years in forestry. Something like 50% of the trees in southeast England have been blown down. And I absolutely loved it. I mean, if you can imagine a tree when it blows down flat, we'd simply cut all the branches off and then pull the trunks out, and they went off to sawmills. They were all dead and dying trees, very, very sadly. I didn't. We worked on a lot of conservation projects, and I absolutely love the outside life. And I'm a landscape painter and a portrait artist. So as you can imagine, being in the landscape, I'd be going everywhere. Oh, there's another painting. Here's a painting. There's a painting. But after 4 years, all this work dried up, and I was back to the dilemma of how am I now going to make a living for the rest of my life before I become a sort of well-known artist. Excuse me a second. And I was discussing this with a dear friend of mine, a guy called Neil Farquharson, who's still a good friend. And Neil at the time was working in one of these living museum things, places, and he said, "Actually, Michael, I might have something that'll help you. We're in the process of commissioning murals, and who knows, with the amount of paint that you've probably got left over and your skills, why don't you pitch for the job?" And lo and behold, I got it. So I was painting these large scenes, and surprise, surprise, I ran out of paint, and I couldn't afford to go and buy paint, and it would have been rather an unpleasant experience to go and buy brands of paint which I'd never really liked using. So I had to get my own paint making equipment out, and of course, when you're doing a public arts event, as is rather obvious, friends call in to see what you're doing and have a coffee and all the rest of it. And two artist friends showed up and saying, "Oh, yeah, this looks great. Well done." Yeah, and looked in my paint box, and one of them said, "Hey, you're making paint again, aren't you?" And I went, "No." No, 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 I can tell you're making paint because of the silvery tubes without the labels. And I went, well, yeah, I just made a bit for myself so that just to help me finish off here. Okay, could you make some for us? And no, 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 I don't want to go down that paint making route again. That was terrible before debt and everything like that. No, come and just make a bit. And I said, all right, no, no, I'll give you a few colors, but please don't tell anybody. Oh, no, no, don't worry. Surprise, surprise. 2 days later, the phone rang off the hook. They'd told people. Now I had people demanding that I supply them paint. So I was right back to where I was again, and this time it seemed fairly, the pain of it was gone, and I thought to myself, well, I need paint. They're happy, and I've had a few lessons now in what not to do as trying to start a business, and I made a point actually of bumping into the old advertising editor of the magazine that I'd inappropriately advertised with, a very, very lovely guy called Paul Harris. And I said, Paul, I'm back in business. And he said, I've got just the thing for you. And I go, no advertising here. No, 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 no. He said something much better than that. He said, there's a husband and wife couple, Mr. and Mrs. Winthrop, who are entrepreneurs, and they're in the centre of London. You should go there and talk to them. They'd love you. You'd love what they're doing. So I did. I picked up the phone, introduced myself, went along, met this very lovely couple who I still supply paint to this day. The company's name is Atlantis, and if you're ever in London, anybody, please go and see their store. It's just great. And talking to them, they said, "Yeah, we love the sound of this, but it's very obvious to us as we're business people. You won't succeed. You haven't got capital. You might have some old equipment and stuff, but look, we've got a better idea. Why don't you come and do it here with us? Become our in-house paint maker, and we'll support you. We've got a huge flow of artists through the door on a daily basis, and we can keep you very, very busy." And I did it, and it's probably to this day one of the best business deals I've ever done in my life. However, and now we move to the nitty-gritty bit of something which we should talk about. Let's rather than me regaling you with stories of my life and stuff, let's jump into art materials a bit more. Um, after probably 4 years of working with them very, very well, I to put it probably politely, I made a mistake, and I helped them to have a fire. Now, lesson one that all artists should learn, really before they're allowed to take the caps off the first tubes of paint, is that there's a dangerous spontaneous combustion with oil paints when you dispose of them. Not just my paint, any linseed oil based paint can catch fire when you dispose of it in the form of paint. So when you have rags that you clean your brushes on, or even paper towels, we should assume are the same. If you clean a brush, and as you can imagine, those days I had lots of little stirrers and little paint mills that I was using to make the paint because I'd obviously got to a bigger scale. When you dispose of those rags and things, what happens is that the cotton of the rags is a very reactive material. So is linseed oil. That's why it can dry quickly overnight. So if you remember from school chemistry days, when you have a chemical reaction, you invariably have a bit of heat. And of course, in my case, I had a big bucket full of rags with linseed oil paint throughout. And even though I knew this fact, I had the bucket full of water. Some of the rags now were protruding through at the top, and it was just enough that they were getting enough oxygen that they could do their wicked little deed and catch fire. It was a Sunday, so I just got a call that my studio paint making area had a fire, and I'd probably want to come in. They said there's not much damage, but I think you need to come and, if you like, explain yourself to the fire department. So, of course, when I got there, the fire trucks were there. There'd been only a very localized area. Unfortunately, there was actually a Canadian guy, an artist by the name of Patrick John Mills, and you can look him up. He's over in the Montreal area. Patrick had been working for Atlantis at the time, and he'd done a firefighting course. And talk about luck. So he was there, and he knew exactly which fire extinguisher he needed to grab to put that fire out, which he did. And so the problem then, of course, was that I won't say the relationship had been damaged. It became very apparent that the fire department weren't that happy that the fact that this store was now being used, if you like, on a light industrial scale at the back, and of course there wasn't all the equipment in place to prevent fires. So lo and behold, understandably, Mr. and Mrs. Winthrop said, Michael, I think it's time you've outgrown this, that you move out, find your own premises. So I had to make the big jump and find a place down the road, and I went to Whitechapel, which of course is famous for Jack the Ripper, and that's why we have a one of our additional sets of colour we brought out recently is in the memory of Whitechapel. It's called therefore the Whitechapel set. And so I learned a hard lesson. But the good thing about that was that once I'd parted company from Atlantis, although I still supplied them and still to this day supply them, it meant that I then was supplying lots of other art stores. Now, what makes my paint from different from other brands, and what is the point of all this conversation? From my point of view, when I make a product, oil paint in this particular case, I want to make it the best way that I possibly can. So I put in all the ingredients which are making it, if you like, do its job very, very well. Lots of pigment, only enough oil in there to actually, if you like, wet the pigment enough so that when you paint, you get a real zing of the color and it dries in a timely way and you have greater impact. Now, so what's going on there? Why is it different from other brands? Other brands will often put materials in which I don't believe in, which I would deem to be things like fillers and extenders to make the paint more bulky. The problem with that is that if you do that, it means that the pigment color strength, the pigment percentage, will be diminished, and the oil absorption gets increased. So that what's effectively happening, two things are significantly happening for you, the artist. Number one, that when you paint, that visual impact. And before we came live on the air, I was talking to Stacey, who I at Delta there, who I just met, and she said that she's just started using my colors within the last 12 months, and she said some very, very nice things. And I asked her the usual questions about why she liked it and what she found, and she said phrases like the pigment intensity, I can't remember the exact word she used, but I'm proud to say this is what I generally hear all the time. The richness of the color, the impactfulness of the color was there. And so that is what you get when you have a fully pigmented paint. If the paint, as I say, being diluted down so that there's other items in there, it means that then you get the more of the physical nature of those other items, the whatever they are, and they look generally like white dry powders. When you put those on their own into linseed oil, it would go looking like Vaseline. They don't have any tinting power of their own. They're what we call, in some contexts, inert pigments. They don't have a color. I mean, the simplest way to imagine is if you took chalk, ground it up into a found powder, and then ground it into linseed oil, it would just look like a gel. It would be sort of an amber colored gel because the white of chalk doesn't actually have any real tint power, unlike something like titanium dioxide, titanium white. So in principle, the idea of those fillers is all right. However, what you're also doing is, from a longevity point of view, think of my fists as particles of pigment. And of course, a pigment particle is a non-soluble little lump, micro sized lump of color. And what you do if you take my fist being the particles of pigment, if you stretch them out now, because there's other things in between these other fillers, it means that also the UV light can get to that pigment particle much more and break it down over time. If all the pigment particles are nicely bunched together, like a row of soldiers, it means they defend themselves against the UV light, which is coming either into the gallery or the studio window or wherever the painting is now hung. So in a sense, the more I do one thing is the more I do the other. The more pigment I can get in there, not only is there the more wow factor that you, the artist, will have in terms of that color luminosity, which of course is right back to that day I first looked at the Rembrandts and then went and ground umbers, and immediately I could see that lusciousness. Not only will you see that, but of course down the road in 30, 40, 50, or even a couple of 100 years, the more I'm doing the other thing, so the more bang for bucks we're going to get We're going to have greater intensity of color, that richness, and also greater light fastness. And it also means that you, the artist, won't struggle as much as well, because I have a particular philosophy, as you can all probably imagine. I literally talk to thousands of artists a year, and I think of myself as a tool maker. You guys have to do the hard part. I do the easy part. I'm just a glorified mixer. I grind pigment into color. So I do the easy bit. You do the hard bit. But what I'm trying to do is make for you a tool that really works for you, helps you. I want that tool to be your friend. I want it to be so that you love the material. I mean, to me, even the smell of oil paint is so, oh, it's all part of that process. I mean, I remember when I first painted with oils, which would be probably when I was about 8. My dear grandmother had been an artist, and she gave me a paint box of 1915 to 1920 little tubes of oil color. And I remember squeezing out rose madder, genuine rose madder, and smelling it. Oh man, not only was it a beautiful color, but the smell of it. And it's just, I find oil paint, I think it's so important we have to love the material that you as an artist are working with. In the same way, if you're a sculptor, you have to love that material. Because if you don't love that material, it's going to show in your work, isn't it? So my particular philosophy is make the paint your friend. And so it's almost as if you can rely upon it as if it's not there. The whole painting process becomes an ease of fluency, and you can trust your friend to paint. When you become, if you like, struggling with the material, so that you're looking at your canvas and you're going, this is changing, that's changed, I don't like this bit, and why is it drying unevenly? Then it becomes an obstacle, because then you're having to correct. I mean, painting and drawing is hard enough as it is. Joking aside, it's a hard thing to do. We know that. And that's why we measure geniuses who are really good at doing that hard thing. And of course, we all know those names. But don't make it any harder. If you set up the materials as your friends so that you can predict. Some artists like to not be able to predict. They like spontaneous surprises. That's something else. But from my point of view, as a portrait painter, particularly, I want the paint to behave like I know it's going to, so that when I do the mixing on the palette, and when I take that brush stroke from the palette to the canvas, I want to know what it's going to do. And more importantly, I want to know what it's going to do over the next few days as well, as it dries. I mean, from my own inclination, I like paint to remain completely, as much as possible, as to the moment I put it down on the canvas. Because when you make that decision to step back from your canvas and think, yeah, I'm happy with that brushstroke, I'm happy with it there forever, that is a decision. What I particularly don't like in painting is if something therefore changes. I come into the studio over the next couple of days, and maybe the paint's changed. It could be that it's gone duller, and that's why coming back to it. This is why I do what I do, because I want paint to be my friend and be predictable. What I don't like, for instance, supposing I'm my own portrait now, and I've painted me, and I then notice, for instance, over the next few days, these shadows here in my eye sockets, they become dull looking. Or, we all know these phrases of things like oiling out. Now, unfortunately, although Mother Nature's been very, very kind to give us a wonderful material, linseed oil and other oils, of course, Mother Nature's given us this wonderful, wonderful gift. However, it's not a perfect medium. There's no such thing as a perfect medium. Certain colors, and particularly those umbers, the umbers and lamp black particularly, when they dry, and it doesn't matter what substrate, when I say substrate, I mean what's underneath the paint, whatever's there, those colors particularly will tend to dry matte. And we of course, as painters, we call that sinking. Now, all the other colors generally, in my case, with my paint, and I'm sure Stacey, I'm pretty confident Stacey and most artists would agree with this. When you paint my paint out and then you step back and a few days passes, you'd look and you go, oh, is it dry? And you have to touch to establish it's dry. And what I like personally is to be able to touch it and go, oh yeah, it is dry. It looked wet. Because I want it to be like that moment I put that brushstroke down. Because for me, that is how I like my paint to be. Some of you might like your paint to be matte looking. That's fine. That's your artistic decision. And of course, we have mediums which can also help you increase that matteness, should that be your goal. I mean, not surprisingly, I get probably over a course of a year, hundreds, thousands possibly, of artists emailing me, calling me up with questions. And there's certain questions that come around again and again and again. And if I was to tell you, for every 10 questions I get, they invariably start like this. Oh, Michael, I wonder if you can help me. I love your paint. But anyway, I've got this thing where I painted yesterday or I painted the day before. It looked great. I've come into my studio now and all the colors have gone dull. Why is that? And at that moment, I invariably say to them, are you painting on acrylic primer? And they go, yeah, but what's that got to do with how would you know? I go, well, okay, it's the characteristic of most acrylic primers to be very porous and therefore absorbent. So what's happening there is that it's sucking the oil out and leaving the paint therefore matte and dull looking. And this is what you're up against. And okay, but how do I fix that? And I go, okay, well there's a couple of ways you can do it. However, that's what I'm talking about. And a lot of artists are so used to painting on an acrylic primer like that they think that is the natural process that oil paints go, this dull looking thing. So that after a few days or weeks, whatever it is, you have to either oil out, as the phrase goes, which I'll explain in a second, or using a retouch varnish. Now, the problem with those is um, when you then have to be doing, shall we say, something which is correcting or getting the paint back to where you want it to be, getting that nice, luscious, fruity color thing back, you're starting to fight the material. It should already, from my point of view, I like to be able to look at my paint after 4 or 5 days and going, oh yeah, yummy. I can't wait to paint more on this. This is great. I want to line up all my events so that they all happen in my favor, and that so I can see the paint surface as a where I want it to be. Now, as I said, what tends to happen, of course, is the acrylic primer will suck the oil out and render it matte looking. There's a couple of tricks which I used to tell artists to do before. One would be, yeah, if you are painting on an acrylic primer, whether you've primed it or the store has primed it in-house or from the manufacturer or whatever, one way you can get around that is to quench that thirst of the acrylic primer. And what I actually, and I'll helps me gesticulate with my hands if I've got something here. We're going to pretend this is a canvas. If you lay that canvas flat down on a table and pour, this is an acrylic primed canvas now, store bought, and you pour on a liberal amount of linseed oil all over. Get a nice rag, spread it out, lint-free. Don't use a paper towel because the paper towel will roll up and break off and they'd be forever picking flecks off. Spread that oil out all over. So you quench the thirst of that primed surface all over. Leave it a few hours so it's soaking in nicely, and then wipe it dry with another rag. Dispose of the rags. I didn't tell you. Keep the rags in metal containers and dispose of them. I personally, to avoid any fire risk, when I'm painting, I take my rags outside and I burn them on an old discarded barbecue. Once they've burnt twice, once they can't burn twice, that's how I get rid of them. So I forgot to tell you the end of that story, didn't I? Anyway, that was how to avoid that. Okay, so wipe it so that there's no discernible greasy surface again on your primed acrylic canvas. Dispose of those rags, and then because you've quenched the thirst, it means that the surface is now no longer going to act like a sponge, sucking all the oil out. That's one of the easy way around. Now, out of every 10 artists I get calling me like this, they of course they don't want to go through that process. And I then decided, well, all right, another way of solving it would be to develop a primer that doesn't suck the oil out, an acrylic primer. So we spent 4 years until we found an acrylic resin that actually doesn't do this. So if you forgive me for a moment, just being slightly commercial here, we have a range of what we call our non-absorbent acrylic primers, NAPs for short. And I'm not sure if you guys at Delta have got the product there or not, but it behaves just like a conventional primer. Two good coats and follow the instructions on the container, and then you've got a completely sound surface to work upon. And lo and behold, it won't suck out all the oil of the paint, making it look dull. So that's one of those things where I was able, for and I'm saying probably a third of all my calls are usually around problems with primers and this. Now, coming back to the other things of needing to oil out or apply a retouch varnish, I'll explain to you what the fat over lean principle is, which some of you might have heard about. When you build up layers of paint, because oil paint dries by absorbing oxygen from the atmosphere, and therefore it gets a little bit heavier and it gets slightly bulkier. So the more oil there is in a paint, the more it will do this. So when you have a low oil content paint, like say a lead white or a titanium white, and you can always tell those tubes because they're heavy in your hand, they're the lean ones. When you pick up a tube of paint, something like say an alizarin crimson or a Prussian blue, these are really light in your hand, and that's because it's natural for them to have a high oil content. These are very thirsty pigments, and therefore they suck up a lot of oil. When you have a lead white or a titanium white, it's the other way around. So a tube of lead white paint is probably 80%-ish pigment and only 20% oil. When you have a tube of alizarin crimson, for instance, or Prussian, that's probably going to be 25% pigment, if that, and the rest is oil. It's the other way around. So, of course, therefore, not surprisingly, when Prussian blue dries, it's going to expand quite a bit as compared to, say, lead white because of the level of oil in it. So there's going to be hardly any growth or expansion. So that way, when you paint layers of your painting, you really want to have the lean coats at the lower layers and become oilier as you go out. When I'm doing it this way, I'm pretending we've got a cross section of a canvas. You've got your canvas here, a primer, and then the various layers. Now, should you be a painter who finds that you've been painting on an acrylic primed canvas, which is very porous and has been making the paint dry very matte looking and dull looking, and you then think, well, okay, I'm going to do the standard practice of oiling out. So you then introduce a very thin layer of linseed oil all over the painting. And of course, you can either choose to let it dry for a couple of days. I'm talking like you just take a brush and you just literally damp the surface with linseed oil so that it brings back the fruity color. Doesn't really almost have it's not like there's a proper glazed layer there. The problem with that is you're now having to do something in the process. You're also introducing, albeit a very thin layer, you've actually then potentially started to break the fat over lean principle. Because then if you find that you want to add more layers on top of that oiling out layer, you've now, supposing if you put a lead white or a titanium white neat on top of it, you've now, of course, got a layer underneath, which is a potential weak spot. I mean, think about it, layers like a sandwich. If your lower layer is very lean and therefore isn't going to expand very much, that's fine. However, if you put now a layer of a very oily paint there, or an alizarin crimson or a Prussian blue, should we say, and you let it dry, and then go over the top with, say, a lead white, you've got you're breaking the fat over lean rule. I mean, another way I can describe it in a practical exercise. Supposing I decide I'm going to paint a nocturne, a night scene, and so I paint my canvas a nice dark Prussian blue, and I layer it on, and I'm really going for it, and I trowel on maybe a 1/16 of an inch of Prussian blue all over, and I think, yeah, that'll make my nice dark night sky, and then I go, oh, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to put some nice. It's a moonlight night now, so I'm going to put a nice globule of paint for the moon, and I'm going to have some nice fluffy cumulonimbus clouds, and I'm going to use lead white. Dollop I go on, nice and thick. Now, that's fundamentally breaking the principle of the fat over lean rule, because now, of course, I've buried the fast drying Prussian blue and the very oily content Prussian blue by a layer of very lean paint, which of course is not going to expand and contract. It's a bit like if you built a house and you made the foundation of the house out of rubbery expanding bricks. Not surprisingly, the rest of the building is going to eventually have cracks going through it, and that's really what fundamentally can happen in a painting. I'll be absolutely honest with you. I think to cause a fat over lean problem, you really have to break the rule. And like I said with the Nocturne, bury, if you like, a very fat paint, and it's one that's light in your hand, remember. The lean colors are the ones which are heavy, the fat ones are the ones with that are light. And that's an easy way you can do it. If you have a tube of a lean one, a cadmium red, a titanium white, a lead white, you'll notice they're very heavy. And then if you have tubes of something like phthalocyanine, phthalo blue, Prussian blue, alizarin crimson, even the permanent version included, you'll notice they're very light. So that's fundamentally breaking that principle. If you paint alla prima, what we mean by that is all in sort of one go, so that you're mixing the layers together, that alleviates it because they're sort of drying at an intermixed level, that given expansion will be compromised by each other. So that alleviates it. But anyway, the as I said, if you forgive me for just putting a commercial hat on for a moment, the easiest way, of course, is to start a primer, our non-absorbent acrylic primers, and you can find all this information on our website. It's all there, and we do the primers in a number of colors. And so please, I invite you to visit our website and explore that. Other things that might make our paint different. We like to put lots of information on the side of the tube, everything that you could possibly need as a painter, fast drying, slow drying. I mean, some of you are perhaps plein air painters where you want to get out of the landscape, and therefore you'd quite like it if your paint dried in a fairly timely manner. A couple of days, particularly if you're then jumping on a plane after a week, you want to have it so that it's got a reasonable chance of getting home without being smudged. So look at the sides of the tubes, and you will notice things like the speed of drying, what the and the oil content. The oil content, of course, comes back to the fat over lean. What type of pigment it is, and of course, importantly, how light fast it is. Now, I personally love colours like alizarin crimson and rose madder, and I'll be absolutely honest with you, they're not as light fast as we'd ideally like. We also make the permanent version of the alizarin crimson. We call it alizarin claret. And that gives me an opportunity also to talk about the color index system. You'll also see on our tube's color index numbers, and you probably think, well, what's that got to do with it, and how does that help me? If you're spending your hard-earned money, the money that you've earned by selling paintings, and you go and buy paints, in all honesty, you want to make sure you're getting your money's worth. There is an international code which we paint makers use, which comes out of more industrial use of pigments, actually. There's an international code which is very useful for understanding which pigment's which. Now, for instance, you might have heard this term hue, which of course is the French word for color. So if you see a phrase like vermilion hue, that's not vermilion. All they're saying by that is it's a color like vermilion. So it's vermilion color of. And I don't particularly approve of that, particularly because vermilion, true vermilion, mercuric sulfide to me is a wonderful, wonderful pigment and hideously expensive, sometimes very hard to get from a paint making point of view, hard to get, let alone for you guys, therefore. And because it's expensive and does a job wonderfully for doing flesh tones, it's expensive and you want to get your money's worth. So you have to look for the code for true vermilion, which is pigment red 106. So you'll see a PR 106. We're only allowed to put that on our tubes if that is the content. So what I invite you to do, and good color charts, like dare I say the back of this one here, you will see that all our colors listed there, it'll tell you the pigment code numbers for there. And of course, it's all in the Ralph Mayer book. It's something that as your knowledge, as your thirst for knowledge in painting, and it doesn't matter whether you've been painting 30 years or 30 days. I believe that the greater our knowledge is as painters, it makes us better painters. But also in the context of what you're paying for. So cobalt blue hue doesn't mean it's got cobalt pigment in it. It just means it's a color like it. So beware of that. Always look for the true color index numbers. And rather than me sit here and regale you with a long list of which numbers for each pigment, I invite you. All that information is again available on our website or in good books, not just the Ralph Mayer. Now I can talk and talk and talk. Renee, do we have any questions, or are there any questions out there that people would like to throw at me, or any, if anyone's even got a funny story about being a painter, all are entertaining. So please don't hesitate.
All right. So, Michael, we have a few questions that were put in
Great.
chat. One is toxicity. Are
Yeah.
there additives in oil paint that can cause respiratory issues?
Yes. Not in mine. Um, I'm not going to sit here and just be disparaging about my competitors technically. I make oil paints the best way I can for me, and we don't put any solvents in our paint. Our paint is only linseed oil and the pigments and a very, very small amount of a wax-like substance which stops the separation out. If you just make generally with paint, pigment and oil, the pigment sinks and it's therefore completely unusable after about an hour. So we have to put a small amount of a wax-like substance in. We don't put anything in that's a solvent, no petroleum distillates. We don't put any artificial dryers in the paint. We put a dryer. Oh, having said that, I make one titanium white, and it says on very bold letters with dryers. It's our titanium white number 3. And as I jokingly always say, it's for the impatient art students of London who always paint in cold studios. Warmer the paint, the faster it is to dry. Sunlight, etc. Also, it speeds that up. So we don't put any of these what I regard as horrible things in. Not only do they detract from the quality of the paint, but again can give you guys some respiratory problems. And I remember I was actually doing a talk some years ago in Calgary, just down the road from there, from you guys, and I was in quite a large room, and group of art, maybe 20, 30 artists, all sitting down there at the front near me. And there was this one lady at the back of the room, and I, after a while, said, why don't you come? Why did come on, come down here? You can join in, you know. And she said, no, no, Mr. Harding, I was interested to come along here, but I can't paint with oil paints. I said, why not? And she said, I get terrible headaches. And I said, I can promise you, you will not with mine. And she said, no, I don't want to take the chance. I said, please. And I then explained we don't put anything in like methyl ethyl toxin, which you think, what on earth is that? It's known in the industry as MECO. I think it's in the process of being made illegal because of the problems it causes. It's what would be known industrially as an oxygen scavenger. Now, why is that in there? When paint is made, if you get a little bit of air trapped in, and if you're particularly working with a color, I don't know, let's go back to Prussian blue again. Prussian blue is a very, very fast dryer. So if you have a bubble within the tube, there's enough oxygen within that bubble that it might be enough to set up skin. So in other words, your bubble after a few months now has got a skin lining of it. And of course, from you as an artist, then you're squeezing out paint and suddenly pop, out comes the bubble and it got a nice lump of skin with it. And you think, oh, this is horrible. So the oxygen scavenger is very, very clever because what it does, it evaporates into that bubble and neutralizes the oxygen. It gets to the oxygen before the linseed oil can. And remember, oil paints dry and cure, if you like, by combining with the oxygen from the atmosphere. So it's a blocker, if you like. It stops the oxygen being absorbed and turned into the oily skin paint layer. So that's what it's in there for. You might ask, well, how can Michael Harding get around that? And what we do, I mean, we found as a practice works, is that when we fill tubes, we squirt the paint in under fast pressure. So it's a bit like when you have a ketchup bottle and you go like that. It's the same principle. Rather than the ketchup finding its way through to the cap end, the paint is being used by the velocity of that motion, so that when my guys are tube filling, and you can hear a bubble because it goes pop because it's the air being left behind. That tube is then set aside, so we check to make sure that it's not got a short measure, because that could be a teaspoonful of bubble, which you don't want in the tube. And that's how we get around it. I would all honestly say probably we get half a dozen tubes returned to us a year, where there might be a bit of skin from a bubble that's crept in. And we always have a no questions asked policy of replacement. Absolutely. Whenever an artist isn't happy, we need to make them happy. So that's our policy on that. So I can say with complete pride that we don't put anything in which will give you respiratory problems. Now, mediums are rather different. We do essentially two types of mediums. We've got mediums which are based upon turpentine or Canada larch turpentine or Canada balsam, and they also have normal turpentine in it. Now that's a different entity. That, even when I paint with those, have a ventilated studio. I'm quite fortunate because I'm not sensitive. Even if I had all the doors and windows closed, I'm fortunate. I love the smell, and fortunately for me, I don't get headaches. However, my wife does. So when I'm painting at home, we have to have all the doors and windows opened, or I'm banished to the outside world with the painting. Turpentines do have a health concern in terms of an inhalation. So please always ventilate your studio area. The other range of mediums we've developed a very special material. We call it our miracle medium. And I'm grateful for the question because it gives me an opportunity to discuss this. So many artists want a solvent, if you like, or this came about. I sat down with artists one day and I said, what else can I make for you that which would really help you in your studios, not just with the paintings, but in any other way? And they, of course, universally all said, well, something we can paint with that can be a medium, which doesn't give us respiratory problems, doesn't give us headaches, doesn't have an unpleasant odor, and is good for the painting. And I pondered on this. I thought, oh, heavens, this is going to be a rather difficult ask, and also not toxic, not flammable. And so I sat with a couple of good chemist friends of mine, and I bounced this off them, and they said, "Yeah, this isn't rocket science. This wouldn't be terribly difficult to develop." And I said, "You serious?" So after about 3 or 4 years, they came back to me with the material that it was backwards and forwards a lot, which we made work. And I have, as a result of what I call my miracle mediums. And I think when I tell you the credentials, you'll see why I've been rather audacious in choosing the term miracle to describe it, which we're also lucky enough to trademark the name in terms of an artist material. It's 100% vegetable matter. It's 100% vegan. It's 100% non-flammable. If I had a screwed up piece of paper and I set light to it and poured the liquid on, it puts it out. It's completely non-toxic. My toxicologist, who's based in New Jersey, when I said to him, well, what warnings do I have to legally put on there? And he said, well, you don't have to have anything, really. This is such a easy material. I said, but what about if someone drinks it? And he goes, well, even that's not going to poison them because this is 100% vegetable matter. I said, but I need to put something on there to discourage people from drinking it. And there's two reasons why you won't. One is because of it tastes utterly disgusting. So stick to other drinks. But he's just said, look, just if anyone drinks it inadvertently, just keep an eye on them, which I thought was quite funny anyway. You'd have to keep an eye on them anyway if they're drinking paint mediums. That's humorous, of course. And so yeah, you can use it either for cleaning your brushes. It's virtually odorless. There's a slight smell, which is sort of hardly there. There'll be no headaches, no allergic reactions. You can see now why I called it a miracle medium, can't you? Because it ticks all the boxes. You can The only thing that I find that some people have said is a drawback is if they put a very considerable amount, and when I say considerable amount, I mean sort of over 15 or 20% of the paint volume, it will slow drying down. Up to 10%. 10% is what we advocate, and it won't change the drying speed. It has no effect upon the light fastness. I've done extensive tests over a couple of years with accelerations where we put it into a box with intensive UV lights over it. Uh, it is an absolute gem of an answer for artist needs in that department. So there's no odors. We also found that it would dissolve damar. So we've made a range of where we've taken our existing mediums and swapped out turpentine, if you like. That's probably an easy way of thinking about it. So we've been able to make glazed mediums. We've been able to incorporate it with beeswax to make an impasto medium. When I say impasto, I mean chunky brush, it holds the brush stroke. Um, Try to make something absolutely useful for artists in that respect. And we are selling huge amounts of it. And I hope Delta, if Delta hasn't got it, it'd be something I'd love them to get because it really, really works. And with those credentials, dare I say, I think it is a miracle. You can just clean up with it or put it in the paint. You'll be absolutely fine. All the details again are on our website or on every container. Are there any more questions?
Quite a few, yes. The next one would be uh, thoughts on oil on acrylic gesso versus oil primed.
Okay, acrylic gesso, of course you can paint how you like. And if you like your paintings to go matte and dull, I'm not arguing and saying somehow that's artistically wrong. Acrylic gessos are the main culprit for this absorption thing, sucking the oil out. Um, I don't even like the term a gesso because a real gesso was made by rabbit skin glue or hide glue, which is like a soupy. It looks like a soup, and when it's cool, it goes like a gel. And that combined with chalk, that was traditional original gesso. Uh, Combinations of acrylic gesso, sorry, acrylic resin and chalk, therefore, that it has become this term of acrylic gesso. And I don't like it because I think it's deceptive. I would prefer that we in the artist industry just refer to as an acrylic primer. That's my own gripe there. Yeah, the acrylic gesso will be fundamentally the one which will be absorbing, making the paint go dull looking. Now, I did also forget to tell you earlier on, if you do have an acrylic gesso pre-prime canvas, if you take one layer, one coat of our non-absorbent acrylic primer and paint it over, so you're putting our acrylic primer effectively over someone else's acrylic primer, it will seal it and stop it doing all this absorption thing as well. So it's one way of converting an absorbent canvas to one which is more, dare I say, user-friendly. Um, any other question that you'd like me to have?
How does your white titanium hold up for light fastness or turning yellow?
Okay, that opens up a really good area because it used to be traditional, and you'll read there's a lot of material out there on the internet, particularly at the moment, about use of zinc white. We originally used to make titanium white and combining it with a small percentage of zinc white. And the reason for that was that when titanium white is one of those, it's a weird pigment. It doesn't particularly like staying incorporated or keeping the oil that it has incorporated in with it. So when it tends to dry, the oil tends to come to the surface and you tend to get an ambery color um, of the natural color of the linseed oil. So one makes the assumption it's yellowed. It hasn't really. It's simply that you're getting a layer, if you like, of the natural color of the oil. Now it's quite important to understand this. And the question was, of course, well, let me answer the question before I go rattling off down a rabbit hole here. Um, we took the decision to take the zinc white out of our titanium white because I noticed there was a painting I did myself where I used only zinc white. And I noticed that where I had reason to re-stretch the canvas, I made a mistake in the composition, so I decided to make the painting smaller. So I restretched it on a smaller stretcher. And when I took the canvas round, bent it around the corner, now the new corner, some 2 inches in to the painting, I noticed that the paint delaminated, cracked, flaked, came off. And I knew this was the only painting that I'd done in years, only using zinc white. So I thought at that point myself, oh dear, all the controversy you'll read from the Smithsonian about zinc white is true. And even if there is an argument that a small percentage doesn't matter, I'm not going to take the chance. So that day we decided to banish zinc white from our entire range. Now the zinc white was very helpful in the titanium because it kept the oil paint incorporated in and added a certain whiteness. But I had to take the chance that although the odd customer might call me up and say, Michael, your titanium white's got this yellow cast to it of the oil, I thought it's fundamentally more important to give you a white paint that would be more long lasting. Now it gives me the opportunity to talk about something else here, which I feel is very, very important. This is one of our Michael Harding color charts with real oil paint. Now you'll notice, I think you can see in my screen, we have a titanium white with safflower oil, then we've got the linseed oil based ones, and then we have the odd lead white one. And you'll notice that certain colors have a more creamy cast to them. Now, this color chart by definition is kept flat, folded up like this, so the paint is in the dark. Now, let me read to you what I actually print on this color chart, because this is exactly what we're talking about here. To obtain the best results visually from this color chart or any painting, always display them in a good light, but away from direct sunlight. Direct light, I often, if I've got a painting I want to dry, I will shove it into sunlight and it's going to be good there for weeks, months, whatever like that. Even Alizarin Crimson is going to be all right there, but we don't keep our Rembrandts in direct sunlight. That's what I'm saying. So long term. Always display them in a good light, but away from direct sunlight. It is eyesight. It is characteristic of all oil paint to exhibit a light yellow shade if kept or allowed to dry in a bad light. You will notice this particularly with certain colors such as cobalt violet light and the lead-based whites. Let's have a look at cobalt violet light. Actually, it's fine. It's there, but anyway, if you do a painting at home or wherever, and you think to yourself, okay, I want to paint it I want to put it somewhere that's safe to dry, where the kids won't knock into it, the cat won't walk past it and put fur on it. So I'm going to put it in a dark cupboard or a dark drawer. It's actually the worst thing you can do. If you dry paint in a dark area, the yellow cast thing of the linseed oil would become very apparent. And you can conduct an experiment yourself with this. If you don't want to mess up canvas, but anyway, if you take, say, the disposable palette paper you have for oil paints, if you painted this entire square titanium white and you tear it in half and you put one half over on the window ledge, the windowsill, to dry in good sunlight, good light, and then you put your other half into your dark drawer where you would normally be putting the painting where the kids won't run into it. Give them 10 days so that they're going to be dry. Bring those two halves back together, and you'll notice that the half that was in the dark drawer for the last 10 days has got a far more yellow color upon it. It's made it very much more murky and looks old. The part that was dried in the good sunlight is now touch dry, and it's crisp and whiter. Now, the fun thing is that over the next few days, if you put them both now on the windowsill, the half that was dried in the darkness will start getting lighter. It'll start getting clearer, but it will never get quite as clean as light as the part of the painting that's been dried in the good light. And you can put those two halves up together and you'll see that very apparently. And I invite everyone to do that as a little experiment. So when you do your paintings, store them in good light. It's one of those things almost as if it permanently handicaps them. If you dry a painting in darkness, it will take on that yellow cast that we see particularly with titanium white more. I hope that answers the question. Okay.
I believe so, yeah. So another question that goes well with talking about your white paints would be, could you please talk a bit about your lead white replacement paints? And then in brackets, they put warm white.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, you're quite lucky in North America that you haven't been prevented from, I mean, forgive me if I'm wrong on this, but I believe certainly the United States allows the sale of lead white. I believe also that's the case with Canada. Is that the case, Renee and Stacey?
Yeah, we got it.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah. In the UK they banned it, and Europe they banned it. Australia's still okay, and the reasoning behind it is that they think that artists are incompetent, the government that is, and they somehow think that we're going to get confused with mayonnaise or toothpaste and start eating it or putting it on our sandwiches or whatever like that, which I find to be quite ridiculous. So for the
Mm.
UK, I
Mhm.
created a warm white. The wonderful thing about lead whites is they have this very nice, I won't call it parchmenty color. They're slightly more creamy and softer as a white. Titanium white, from my point of view, tends to be very chalky and isn't always the best intermixer. Particularly if you mix it with, say, a cadmium red, it doesn't bring out the best of the red. You're not going to get a zingy pink. You'll get a better one with a lead white, and sadly, you used to get an even brighter and cleaner one with zinc white. But of course, you've got the structural problem of the zinc white there. So we developed specifically for the UK market initially, what I called a warm white to give them something slightly different from just straight titanium. If you read on the side of the tube, you'll see that it's got various other pigments in there, a yellow ochre effectively, and you can do that yourself. You could make exactly that warm white yourself by doing that. Strangely enough, I find that the warm white, because it's a softer color, we sell just huge amounts of it. And I jokingly say to artists, it's clouds in a tube, because from a landscape painter's point of view, you squeeze it out and it's immediately, big cumulonimbus clouds on a sunny day with sunlight on it. It's just that color straight out the tube. And sometimes we'll make colors what we call a convenience color, which is intermixing certain pigments if you like to be useful to you guys. I generally like and favor single pigment colors uh, for that reason as well. Now, as I said, I'm just trying to think if there's anything to add about the fact of the legality. Yes, we can still sell lead whites into North America. I hope they change the laws sometime in the UK. I would prefer it if there was a thing where I mean, a lot of this leads me also, of course, into toxicity slightly. I would prefer that to have a license, if you like, to buy lead white paint. It would be simply an act of going on a simple course where you understood that the dangers of lead whites, and it wouldn't have to be anything as heavy as taking driving lessons or anything like that. It would be a course where you could probably sit online for an hour, and then it's certain set questions, and if you pass the test, you get a certificate which says that you're competent to go and buy lead white paint. The problem with lead white is that it tastes sweet, and so that's why kids would tend to pull it off old woodwork and things like that. But when kids are at an age they put things continually in their mouths, and lo and behold, they put a bit of flaky paint in their mouth that tastes sweet, and so that's when the problem starts, because then sweet, of course, is inviting. So that's the problem there with that one. Have I answered the question enough about the
I
warm
think
white?
so. Yeah, definitely.
I mean, don't any of you be shy about coming back to me and telling me off if I've got a mind that immediately goes off into other areas, as you probably detected. So bring me back on course if I do go off, and if you don't feel I've answered the question precisely enough, don't be shy about pointing it out.
Maybe we could do some quick round questions.
Sure.
Okay, so we'll touch on someone asking, can you ask Michael to speak about Kremitz White?
Kremnitz white is
Kremnitz White? Oh yeah,
Kremnitz is
okay,
very
cool. Same.
is very, very simply a lead white. It's just
Great.
a name that comes from history. It's a part of the of Europe where Kremnitz lead white was made, and so it's a bit like saying Italian brown or something like that.
Mhm. So same.
Oh, and forgive me because I've been very neglectful of talking about my watercolors today.
Maybe we could have you on to have another one where you talk solely about watercolors.
Sure,
Okay.
absolutely. I mean, in case there's any watercolorists out there, very briefly, I was asked for decades if I would ever do the same with watercolor that I did with oil. And I thought, well, there's no point in just bringing out a watercolor that's like everyone else's. So I wanted to have the same impact as being hugely potent in its color strength. And we did that. The good thing about it is that it allowed me to get my hands on a lot of new pigments. And lo and behold, I thought some of those new pigments would look wonderful in oil, and hence the adding of up to 40 colors. 20 have already been launched, and the remaining 20 will come this year. So that's the good news.
Exciting. Another question would be, does the non-absorbent primer work through an airbrush? They ask because most of their paintings are 3D, either on different plastics or pour printed resin.
Okay. It's one of those things I just have to invite you to try it. Um, I do some model making myself, and I'm not exactly proficient with an airbrush, so I'm still learning that technique myself. The obvious thing would be to initially um, put more water in, and you'd have to give it a really, really good shake up. Try it and please let me know. You might have to increase the pressure. I don't know if it would then splatter. Please, yeah, I mean you can dilute the non-absorbent acrylic primers with water, which makes them apply a lot more easily. Um, yeah, please let me know if it works.
And then, does walnut oil or other oils affect the paint?
Affect the paint? No. In terms of affecting the paint as a negative, absolutely not. Walnut oil and safflower oils we also use in the range, only in a couple of colors though. And people say to me, why? And it's really just for fun. Well, safflower oil is a paler oil and therefore won't do that same linseed oil yellow casting, and that's why we make a titanium white. Our titanium white number one is in safflower oil, number two is in linseed. Um, it's slower drying, but remains lighter, cleaner from that ambery color finish. Walnut oil we put into one of our Kremnitz whites, one of our lead whites. One is in linseed, one's in walnut oil. It takes up slightly less pigment, so therefore it's slightly more translucent. Has a similar drying speed to linseed, and they're both excellent oils, and just it produces a different type of paste, so it's a different type of brush feel. Artists who say to me, "Hey, should I try the walnut Kremnitz?" I go, "Well, yeah, give it a go," and they invariably then change to it, which is quite interesting. Perhaps I should bring out a few more colors and put them in walnut oil. So I hope that answers the question.
And then the next one would be, what is your opinion on water-soluble oils?
I throw my hands up in despair. I know that there's one or two companies who brought them out. I see them. First of all, I'll be absolutely honest with that. I see them more as an amateurish approach. Um, I mean, linseed oil, as I say, is Mother Nature's gift to us. I don't see any advantage with water-soluble oils whatsoever, particularly now since we have the miracle medium as well. Because the only argument that anyone's ever really put to me would be, I'm a plein air painter. I want to have bottles. I don't. I want to have a bottle of something I can use to increase the flow of the paint, but I can't fly whatever solvent. So that's another way we were able to address it with the miracle medium, because it can fly in 100 ml bottles. It can fly, and it can certainly go in your hold luggage on planes. Um, I tried some water soluble paints myself a few months ago, and I was shocked as to from my point of view, how bad the handling quality was. I couldn't believe um, the stodginess, the greasiness. And even when you do apply water with them, it doesn't really it sort of goes a bit like clotted cream. It would coagulate irregularly, and it's as if the water didn't really like it, or vice versa. And so I just can't believe why anyone would try and use them. And I mean, all right, there is this merit that therefore you don't have to have a bottle of something. You can pour water out of a tap somewhere, but it's just horrible and doesn't help you make good paintings. I mean, to me, it's about making good paintings. Anything that would help me produce a better painting is the way to go as far as I'm concerned.
And then, do you have any tips for painting on copper?
Um, Only that I know it was part of the Dutch, there was a Dutch 18th century school that did a lot of copper painting. I would say that the essential thing I found was that get one of those really fine um, wire wool and buff the surface first. And unless you are buying a pre-prepared copper panel, I like the fact that copper panels and aluminium or aluminum, as they generally say this side of the Atlantic, are coming along because I think artists are getting and artist suppliers are getting much, much more mindful for longevity. And when I say longevity, it's not just a question of the light fastness. If you think about the actual physicality of a painting, if a painting is going to hang somewhere for 300 years, there's lots of things that go on either in a gallery or a home which can cause harm to that painting. And as I jokingly say, if your butler decides that he wants to take the painting down and give it a feather duster over it, just taking it down off the wall brings it into a realm where an elbow might dent the canvas or a broom handle might accidentally poke against it. And sure as anything, it's very hard to drive a hole through a copper panel, but even a relatively light banging of a linen will produce a dent, which can be very problematic to get rid of. Obviously, wooden panels have a slightly better advantage. So, yeah, the longevity of copper panels is excellent. Also, there's a very nice relationship that takes place between oil paint, lead paint, particularly upon copper. You can use various types of primer upon it as well. I'll be honest with you, I as an artist, I won't consider myself an aficionado of the practice of painting upon copper. I've only ever done it on an experimental level. I still paint on linen.
And
So I'm
then,
probably not the best person to ask, but I think absolutely great surface. Um, Harsh because of course it's not springy like linen, but if you can work with that, then absolutely fine. Love it.
what would you use to paint clouds over that Prussian blue sky, titanium white?
Yeah, how to get around that then? Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I've snookered myself in a corner with that one, haven't I, as an example? Okay, if I did want to use that recipe, Prussian blue sky, the most advisable way to go around it would be to paint the Prussian blue as thin as you could get away with, and then while the paint is still wet, a thin coat of your fluffy white clouds. That's the best way I can think of around that one.
And then, so two more questions. Do you have any plans to introduce a gouache line?
Yes. A simple answer to that. A lot of my artists, we do something like 134 watercolors, and defining really with the boundaries between a watercolor and a gouache is a subject of debate. Some argue that any opaque watercolor is really a gouache anyway. We are in a prototype phase of doing gouache, and we've got various artists who are testing our versions of gouache. Um, it isn't just purely simply, I mean, obviously you can convert if it were that easy, you can convert any transparent watercolor to being a gouache if you added an opaque watercolor to it. But of course, it's not really quite like that. Gouaches traditionally contain various clays and so on that give you the sort of the a silky opacity, and it's one of those things that when you ask a gouache painter why they paint with gouache, only they can come up with the words. I'm in my let me think. I'm 66. I've been painting since I was about 8. Um, I have painted a number of times with gouache in my life. I've painted considerably more times with watercolor. I think that all of us know good gouache artists, and to ask them how where they see the boundaries lying between a watercolor and gouache. Of course, fundamentally, both have their, if you like, drying resin is gum arabic. Traditionally, there might be some hybrids out there, so they're far more related than, say, oil paint is to watercolor, or vice versa, or yeah, I mean, acrylics tend to be sort of over in their own little area, really, whereas of course gouache and watercolor are completely intermixable. But yes, simple answer to the question is yes, we plan to. So if anyone wants to, if there are gouache painters out there, which one would suspect from that question, drop me a line. And so, any observations about what you consider to be fundamental as a gouache, or any particular colors that you would particularly like me to put in, I will certainly listen to that. We're not going to be, where we do 134 in the watercolors, we're not going to be doing, our plan at the moment isn't to do 134 gouache. We'll probably do about 70. So watch this space. Another question, maybe?
So we will have 2 questions, one from Stacy and one from Matt. So we're going to start with Stacy and then we're going to end with Matt, okay?
Yep.
So I see that you have a variety of mediums. We sell them all here at Delta. Like there's the
Thank you.
Damar glaze medium, resin oil wax medium, oleo resin medium, balsam resin glaze medium. Lots of different types of mediums, even beeswax paste. Like I
Yeah.
myself am debating like which one to get and why. And I understand some of them probably leave a little bit of a thicker, more satin finish. Some of them are
Yes.
more thin. Why would you choose a medium that has like a solvent in it as opposed to just a regular oil, drying time? Just a brief
Okay.
explanation.
Okay. Uh, just clarify, we don't put a solvent in, we put turpentine in. I mean,
Oh,
okay,
yeah.
so someone might sit and argue with me about when's a solvent and when is it a resin, but you see what I'm getting at. We put gum turpentine in our which of course is distilled pine sap. We don't put a solvent as such in. Okay, but coming back to your question, it's one of those things I always say to artists, there's no rule, there's no necessity, there's no need to be using a medium. One should only, in my opinion, one should only use a medium if you can't achieve what's in your mind's eye. Now, there are some of my competitors, and this, I know I don't want to sort of sound as if I'm bashing them. Some of them try and sell you lots of mediums. I say to artists, only ever buy a medium, only ever use a medium if you can't achieve what's in your mind's eye. If there's something that the material of oil paint won't do for you, and you're thinking, oh, I've got this effect in mind, and I can't get the paint to flow like it, I can't, then there's necessity. But you can use oil paint straight from the tube. There's no rule that says you have to be using a medium. That's what I'm getting at. So, okay, then which one are you going to choose? Now, quite clearly, the choice is pretty easy. If you want to increase the flow, there's several which will do that. And they're, of course, going to be, by definition, more liquidy. Shake the bottle, and you can see that straight away, that a liquidy material added to oil paint, not surprisingly, is going to increase its flow. The more you put in, the less chance of it sustaining a brush stroke. And of course, if you pick up a material and it's a paste, and you can see in the jar it's a paste or whatever container it's in, then clearly those are more likely to be impasto mediums. If something has a beeswax in it, it's either going to dry more satiny or it's going to dry matte. For instance, we don't do a lot of varnishes. We only do 2 at the moment. We're working, developing more. Our matte varnish is cloudy because it has beeswax in, and various other mediums, so that they give the artist the opportunity of having a different paint service. Now, people often say to me, I know, but which is the right medium for me? And the all honest answer is, I don't know. You're going to have to experiment and find out yourself, because what might work for one artist would be completely wrong for another. So you've just got to suck it and see, as the old expression goes. Um, but don't forget, there's no rule. I mean, there's no rule that you have to be using a medium.
Okay.
Did I cover that okay?
Yes, thank you so much.
And then Matt's question was, what would you advise for thinning paint down slightly for painting miniatures?
For miniatures,
For
was
miniatures, yeah.
again, it's one of those things you'd have to. Um, I know what I'd love you all to do, and that's make your own sun thickened linseed oil. What a wonderful note to end on. I tried to manufacture sun thickened linseed oil, and because I would need hundreds and hundreds of liters, it became too labor intensive. An easy way, you can find a recipe on our website. I think we've still got it up. Put a tray on a window ledge, one of those enamel trays that you use in cooking, with about a quarter of an inch of linseed oil in it. Put a glass sheet over the top, 4 matches or little wooden slats so it keeps the glass lifted so that the air can circulate. Every couple of days, pour it out into a bottle, give it a damn good shake, pour it back out. You'll notice after a couple of weeks that the oil will start to go goopy and thicker as it starts to pre-dry. It takes oxygen from the atmosphere. You've aerated it, and it'll start to go goopy. And it's a question of how far you want to let it go. You can keep doing it until it just would become a gel. The great thing about it is makes the most incredible painting medium, and I would invite your miniature artist to therefore play with it, because I had this friend years ago. Sadly, an artist is no longer with us. His name was Michael Reynolds, British artist, and my goodness, he knew his materials well. And I was saying to him one day, but surely you can just, what's the point with sun thickened oil? Surely you can just use stand oil. And he said, stand oil is fun, but he said, watch this. We put out a panel, and we took a alizarin crimson and put a bit of stand oil with it, squidged it around a bit, and then we tried to both of us paint out a really thin line with a very narrow brush. And so we did the stand oil first. It was going, yes, 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 nice long streak coming out, getting thinner and thinner. Yes, it's still going, still going. And then it gets to that point where it starts to falter, it starts to skip. So you couldn't quite glaze. If you were doing a glaze, it wouldn't go quite out as far. Then he said, now watch this. And he did the same, but taking a bit of sun thickened linseed oil and combined it with the alizarin crimson. So it was almost like this, exactly the same dollop of paint, but with sun thickened. And he said, now watch. And he pointed it out, painted it out, painted it out. And it went beyond where the other one had faltered and stopped. And he went, see, still going, still going, still going, still going, still going. And he was able to produce a clean, detailed brushstroke, which just kept on going. So I'd invite your. So I didn't catch the artist's name. I know
Matt.
it was Matt. Um, Matt, I would love you to try that. Make some of your own sun thickened linseed oil. You'll find the recipe in either the Ralph Mayer book or on our website. And you only need to make a couple of 100 ml, and you'll start to see the virtues of it. That's how I would go if I was a miniaturist. I think it would allow you to keep the control on microscopic scale almost. And yeah, let me know how you get on with that.
Do you have time for 3 more questions, Michael?
Of course.
Wonderful. Okay, so I'm going to start with Sheila. So they said, I am a new painter and have recycled my canvases with acrylic paint. If I use the non-absorbent primer, can I rescue my canvases?
Sorry, just to clarify, is the painting's only acrylic paint?
Yep.
Um, I can't think of any reason why not. I'm not an acrylic painter. Can't bear the stuff. Surprise, surprise. Um, I can't see any reason why not. If it's acrylic paint with an acrylic primer and then more acrylic paint on top, I can't see a fundamental reason with that being wrong. But it's one of those things I always invite artists to test to the best of their ability first on a bit of discarded canvas. I know this is probably only working for the reasons of economy in terms of being able to rework a stretched canvas that would have otherwise trying to avoid having to discard it and spend money on new materials. Um, yeah, it would be more fundamentally wrong. Clearly, if you were doing it with an oil painting, you wouldn't want to go and put an acrylic primer over the top of an oil painting. And even if you sanded it to avoid any brush strokes, thick brush strokes coming through. With oil paint, the chances are then you're going to be breaking the fat over lean principle, and you wouldn't want to put an acrylic primer or nap over an old oil painting. So I would say with caution, yes, okay.
All right. And then are any of the mediums fast drying? And then we'll do yours.
Yes, we do both in the traditional range of our mediums, the ones based on turpentine. We have a glazed medium, PM2, which is fast drying, and it's one of the products that we actually say in bold writing on it in dryers, metallic dryers in that one, because we don't put dryers in our paint, apart from that titanium one, because dryers can affect the longevity of the paint. When you have it in outside layers, which are glaze layers, it's more flexibility there. So we accept it fundamentally in our layer there. So yes, we do a fast drying version in that. We've also got a fast drying in the Miracle medium, which is the one which has got the Damar in it. We're also working on an additional one because the green credentials of the Miracle medium are so powerful in terms of eco-friendly and biodegradable and vegan. To put a dryer into that to make it dry quickly, we wouldn't want to blow those. I wouldn't go and put a normal traditional dryer in it. I have to have something with the same green credentials to make sure it doesn't give anyone headaches, because the whole good point about the Miracle medium is that there's no headaches, no bad smells. So although we're trying to develop a even faster drying one, it's got to be able to have the same green credentials. So yes, there's a couple. All the information again is on our website. That should be fairly easy to find. And with all these matters, you can communicate with me through my website if you have any further questions. But did that answer that one okay?
Absolutely. And then the last one that we're going to do for the day is again for
This will be
Stacey.
Okay, thank you for your patience. So, you mentioned that you like to paint on linen, and what makes you like inclined to choose linen as opposed to other surfaces, cotton, wood panels? What makes you like linen?
Oh, it's a love of you have to. It's not just a question of knowing whether the material is going to last or not. It's a touchy-feely thing. I mean, it's like if you ask a carpenter what his favorite wood is,
Mm.
and he'll say to you things like, "Oh, I love the smell. I love the way that it works, and I can cut it. I can do this, and it doesn't splinter." And it's pure love affair. I love the texture. I love the drumminess. I don't have a problem with painting on the solid panel. Um, it's harder. I don't know. It's just one of those things. It's like it's the language I've always spoken. So I guess um, the painting on cotton. Cotton has a shorter fiber length, and linen has a longer fiber length, so there's a tensile strength in it. Also, cotton canvases, cotton duck, for instance, is really something which was designed for the upholstery industry purely as a liner, and it tends to be very waxy, and you can have problems when if you are stretching cotton duck, for instance. Sometimes it repels certain acrylic primers because it's waxy coming on top with water. I think that it's so important for an artist to do as much of the preparation work as they possibly can. I know not everyone is physically able to sort of start stretching out 8 foot canvases, and there's a certain dexterity about it. But I know I can say with 100% confidence that the closer you get to your materials, the more you know about them, the better painter you will be. I mean, it's a bit like the more you know about your car engine, the better driver you will be. Coming back to carpenters, if a carpenter walks to the forest and sees the tree and then goes to the sawmill, and then understands the structure of the wood more, it will make him a better carpenter. And the same certainly applies to artists. The more an artist understands about their materials, it would just, and at the very least, it's a more sort of, I love being in the environment of creating paintings. I mean, when I paint, I have an interesting psychological thing I put myself through. I make my own frames as well, and there's a certain type of, and I say this in a nice way. There's a certain time with painting where it can be very masochistic. It's painful because it's hard work. You have to concentrate. It's like, oh, am I getting this bit right? Oh God, I'm exhausted. I need to go and have a coffee. I need to get outside. I need to go and take a walk. It builds attention. And I find for me it's therapeutic to then start making a frame. So and also because then if a painting's at that point of whether it's going to be a keeper or not, is this going to succeed or not? I find that I can increase my psychological commitment to the painting to make more, come on, get it right, Michael. Come on, back to old school, art school sort of mentality of like, make it work, fix it, rather than just scraping it and throwing it away. I find that if I then get a psychological commitment to making a frame to go around it, it works. Also, I'm still in the environment of the painting because I'm thinking about the painting, but now the frame making, although it can be challenging, is decidedly easier because you just measure things. And if you cut a piece of wood wrong, you throw it away and get another piece. And it's a nice psychological exercise, I find. And the other thing I find is that then as the painting evolves, I also change the frame. I mean, if the painting changes direction and I think, I've got to change the color of that frame as well. And I love that. I love the fact that then the frame starts to be married to the painting, and I sometimes will change. I have even ditched the frame. It's better to ditch a frame than it's to ditch a painting. Save the frame for something else another time. Change the frame to match the painting, and I like this relationship of the two together like that. So that all came out of why I painted one and not the other. I love materials.
Mm.
All right, and you're getting a lot of thanks and appreciation in the chat for the information
Great.
session, which is wonderful. We will try to coordinate a watercolor information session soon if you're willing.
Most
And
definitely.
yeah,
I'd love to.
and I think that that can be where we're going to wrap up for the day. Do you have any final notes, real quick, Michael?
First of all, I'd like to say how flattered I am that people have listened in to me today. And this doesn't have to be an end. It's not a goodbye. It's as I've said a couple of times, we have a website. I'd invite you to all to have a good look round. And if you weren't able to get a question into me today, I apologize. You can email me questions. And if you haven't tried my paints, please do. The only caveat is you will find them addictive.
We're going to quote you on that.
Please do, because it's a bit, as I said before we went live, talking to Stacey, it's a Pandora's box. Once that box opens,
Yeah.
I always joke, and I feel a bit like a drug dealer where I get you addicted, then I own your soul. You belong to me now. So
Yeah, pretty much.
the only warning is that you will be mine.
Yeah.